If you say we won't do it, if they don't do it, that's no way to be. To solve these problems, we know that the answer is to take the lead. Smog fills up the skies, plastic in the seas, and each day we lose more species. But if you had a dog, you care for her every day. You want a healthy dog, it's the way to stop the pollution, live the solution, give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is the way. We're cutting too many trees, there's far too much disease, and there's another storm on the breeze. But if you had a cat, you care for him every day, wouldn't you? You want a healthy cat, it's the way to stop the pollution, live the solution, give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is the way. If you say we won't do it, if they don't do it, that's no way to be. To solve these problems, we know that the answer is to take the lead. So here you've got an earth to care for every day. You want a healthy earth, it's the way to stop the pollution, live the solution, give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is the way to stop the pollution, live the solution, give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is the way to stop the pollution, live the solution, give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is the way. Give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is the way. Give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is the way.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Mcdonald, and I am the co-owner of Bookmark in Charlottetown and Halifax, and I'm here to welcome you to our event tonight and to thank a few people before we get going. I'm going to start with our guest, Seth Klein. We want to sincerely thank Seth for being with us tonight, for writing a wonderful, timely, and urgently important book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. And Seth, we're really glad that you agreed to do this event with us this evening. Next, I'd like to thank my co-conspirators in making this event happen. And that is Jane Ferguson and Mary Coper Smith from the PEI chapter of the Council of Canadians. They're the real catalysts in organizing this event and partnering with Bookmark to bring it to you tonight. So thank you, Jane and Mary. I'd also like to thank Seth's publisher, ECW Press, for supporting this event and for coordinating Seth's appearance. And next, I'd like to thank the amazing and a native of Prince Edward Island, but currently the Director of Communications in the Atlantic Canada organizer for the Climate Emergency Unit. Emma stepped up and gave stellar leadership to organizing this event and for managing the technology this evening. If Emma wasn't doing it, you'd be stuck with me and there'd be sure to be problems. Next, I'd like to thank the talented and inspiring Todd Maclean for emceeing tonight's event, for writing a special song to inspire us on our way to dealing with the climate emergency, and in general for his leadership in the climate emergency fight. Thank you, Todd. And next, Julie Pelissier-Lush, an inspiring Mik'maw knowledge keeper and our PEI poet laureate. Julie seems to be everywhere. Every place I go, Julie shows up and does a welcome. So we're glad you're here tonight with us, Julie. We know you're busy, and Julie's going to offer an Indigenous welcome and prayer for this event. And last but not least, to the panelists that are taking part tonight, Stephanie Arnold, Sweta Daboo, and Colin Jeffrey, thank you very much for participating and offering your insights into what you believe should be the next steps in the mobilization for the climate emergency on Prince Edward Island. So again, everybody, welcome. And to all the participants, thank you for being part of this important event. And I hope that that everyone will be motivated to take next steps from being part of this event tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our capable MC, Todd Maclean.
Thank you so much, Dan. Wonderful introduction there with all those great thank yous, and rightfully so, because it's been an amazing group of people that have had to come together to bring this event together, and it's so exciting. It's an honor to be part of it, an honor to host it this evening, and so great to see all of you joining in here. This is exciting. All right, so I've got some notes here. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this virtual book launch for Seth Klein's new book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. Yes. And yeah, it looks like we do have a great amount of people joining in here. So this is just wonderful, once again, to see all of you joining us for this evening. And yeah, we do think we're in store for a really informative and inspiring evening for the next hour and a half. That is, at least. As Dan said, my name is Todd Maclean, and again, just to touch upon the many organizations that have come together to co-sponsor tonight's event: Bookmark in Charlottetown and Halifax, the PEI chapter of the Council of Canadians, the Climate Emergency Unit, and PEI National Farmers Union, CUPE 1870, and CUPE PEI. So thanks to them all. Yes, amazing hard work bringing this event together. As you can see, lots of excitement about Seth's book, which has been called, just to give you some words on it from like feedback from those who have read it. Some really great names here. So Bill McKibben, for example, said, a truly great book. The blueprint for rapid societal transformation that we've all been waiting for, said science journalist Zia Tong. Exactly what we need right now, said former clerk of the Privy Council, Alex Himmelfarb. I was practicing that name earlier. I don't know if I actually pronounced it correctly. Himmelfarb is what I'm going with right now. A Canadian climate emergency manifesto that brings it all together, said former MP Libby Davies. Exactly the book we need right now, said anti-poverty activist Paul M. Taylor. David Suzuki just simply said, read this inspiring book. And this is the roadmap out of the climate crisis that Canadians have been waiting for, says author Naomi Klein. But that's a little suspect. She's his sister. Um, but anyway, yeah, so some amazing words there from very, very amazing people. So our plan for tonight is as follows. I will be your moderator and host for the evening. I'm sure you've already figured that out. In a moment, Julie Pelissier-Lush, a Mi'kmaw knowledge keeper. That's the way she calls herself, knowledge keeper. It's a perfect title for her, I think. And another perfect title, PEI's poet laureate, will be offering a traditional welcome. Then we'll hear from Seth, who will share a bit from the book for about 15 minutes, and then he and I will have some Q&A. Then we'll be bringing on 3 panelists, all local climate emergency activists, to join Seth in a discussion about what the next stage of climate mobilization needs to look like in our province. So that's going to be really exciting and engaging. Then we are going to have a musical contribution from myself. I've got my ukulele here, ready for that. And then we will finish it off and bid you all a good night. So a few logistics. There's a time, or there's a chat there. So like anytime you want, you can just add into that, of course. Most of you know how Zoom meetings work by this point, so you can add in your comments there, any questions as well. So we'll be sharing some links to purchase the book in that chat, to connect with the sponsoring organizations and learn about the music you hear, etc. And if you're having technical difficulties, please put a note in that chat. We have, yes, the wonderful Emma Norton is helping us out with all the technical things tonight. She's doing an incredible job, and she will hop on that. If there's any little technical thing with the sound or video, please let us know. And if you have any questions, as I said, for Seth or for the panelists, put them in the Q&A. Click the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Actually, that's where you should do the questions instead of the chat. Duly noted there. And we will try to bring them into the discussion. All right, so hopefully you can all find the Q&A. Yeah, there it is at the bottom of my screen, I see. Awesome. Okay, so as well, by the way, as you're watching, you're welcome to read more about the book at Seth's website, sethklein.ca. And we're also providing links to purchase the book from the Bookmark in the chat space. The book is available now in print as an ebook and as an audiobook, and we urge you to order the book. We are providing links to the co-sponsors of tonight's event. And after the event, we will be emailing you all these links as well. So that's great. And we are all here because there is a climate emergency. I just have to acknowledge that. And I know that most of you who are on this Zoom call tonight in this meeting are on that same page. There is a climate emergency. So we would like to channel the energy from tonight's event into action. I'm sure a lot of you know about tomorrow, the climate strikes that are taking place. So if there's a climate strike near you tomorrow, which those of you who are joining in from PEI, it's happening in Charlottetown tomorrow. Fridays for Future will be holding a climate rally from 3:30 to 4:30 at Province House. And those of you who are joining in from other parts of Atlantic Canada, of course, just find your nearest location. They always post great information about this online. So yes, global climate strikes coming up tomorrow. So this is a very timely event in that regard. We feel there are lots of great and helpful things we can do to move our governments into climate emergency mode. That's for sure. We believe the next steps may be to host in-person workshops. So, on PEI, for example, one in each county. And if you want to know more, please fill out the survey link that we're going to post in the chat. and we'll also send it in an email as well after this event. All right, so now on with the show. First off, please join me in welcoming Julie Pelissier-Lush to offer a welcome. Julie is an actress and best-selling author of My Mik'maw Mother and Mik'maw Campfire Stories of PEI. She writes, acts, and does photography to preserve the history and culture of the Mik'maw culture for future generations. Julie became the first Indigenous Poet Laureate of Prince Edward Island in 2019, and she lives in PEI with her husband, Rick, her 5 children, and her granddaughter, Mia. So, folks, please join me in welcoming Julie Pelissier-Lush for our Mik'maw welcome.
Thank you, Todd. Oh, this has been an amazing night already. Getting to hear the song in full this time and being able to be a part of this amazing event. Now I'm going to start off. I had some sage going, making sure all of our hopes and dreams and aspirations get sent into the air so that, as Todd had said, that we can start moving things more into action than just words. I'm going to do a quick prayer. Jigaway Niskum. Thank you, Creator, for the gifts that you have given us and the gifts you continue to give us. Thank you for love, for being able to have love, give love, and recover from the loss of love. Thank you for courage, for being able to look inside ourselves and keep telling our truths, even when it hurts. Thank you for wisdom, to know when we are going down the right path and know what we need to share. Thank you for truth, to be able to hear the truth, share the truth, and know that it is good and comes from a good place. Thank you for humility, to know that we are not alone, that we must look after each other and take care of each other. Thank you for honesty, to believe in the things that we cannot see or touch, but we know is real. Thank you for respect, to know everything is a gift that we must treasure and respect ourselves and others. I am Mik'maw, and I reside in this beautiful territory known as Mi'kma'ki, and I would like to welcome each and every one of you in peace and friendship. Eidasu midawajich migadedasit, compt infant important, every child matters. Now, lastly, I'm going to share one last thing. A couple years ago, I was invited to come to an event where we were talking about the environment, and even then, I think we were still acknowledging what was going on in the world, although I don't think we had as concrete scientific proof as we do today. But I wrote this one when I was feeling nervous, but full of hope back then, so I call it The Earth and I. When I see the beauty in the earth, I shudder with delight. When I see the cruelty in the earth, I cry with all of my might. As I look outside my window, I watch each snowflake passing by. I wonder if they notice me as they are falling softly from their home up in the sky. Each snowflake is unique as it falls and flutters by, but once it hits those piles of snow, it becomes just the same as I, blending in like the millions of other people on Mother Earth, with a limited time to shine and make change. The summer has its good points when the days are warm and new, to swim in bright clear water or sail in a birch bark canoe, to sit and dream of love while staring at the moon. But when the heat becomes oppressive, well, we wish for snow then too. The time of dreaming is over. The winter brings the ice and the cold. The bitter cold brings reality, yet doesn't make a sound. Now the dreams we all believe in start with money in the bank, not of children's laughter, love, or the people that we should thank. To look outside ourselves and give help to those in need, to be the people we should be, or even plant a seed. To love and protect the world and all its creatures could be a start. These things to help the earth must come straight from your heart. Be the snowflake that flutters from the sky, full of beauty and hope. Be the one that makes a difference. Be the one who starts a change. Walalio. Thank you.
Will Allen, Julie. That is why you are PEI's Poet Laureate. Wow. Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much. Just had chills all over me, and I'm sitting here looking at the window where we live here in Pinette, PEI, and gorgeous sunset landscape and the seagulls that were all in the field just like went into flight. And wow, that was just incredible. Yeah, thank you so much. That really sets the tone for where we're at this evening. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Seth Klein. Seth Klein is the team lead and director of strategy in the Climate Emergency Unit, a 5-year project of the David Suzuki Institute that Seth launched in early 2021. Prior to that, he served for 22 years, 1996 to 2018, as the founding British Columbia director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, a public policy research institute committed to social, economic, and environmental justice. He's the author of A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, published in 2020, and writes a regular column for the National Observer. Seth was hired to open the CCPA's BC office in '96, and under his direction, the office grew to 15 employees, over 6,000 supporters across the province, and publishes regular research reports on topics such as taxes, poverty and inequality, labor policy, the future of BC's resource sectors, climate change, healthcare, public education, international trade agreements, the BC economy, and much more. The CCPA BC has become an important and visible source of policy analysis and has brought much needed balance to public policy debates in BC. There's much more to be said about Seth, and you can read more about his biography on sethklein.ca. Seth, thank you for being here. It's an honor. I'm handing it over to you.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Todd. Thanks for that introduction. Thank you so much, Julie, for that beautiful opening. I also want to thank Bookmark for this invitation, and the Council of Canadians for co-sponsoring, and thanks in advance to Sweta and Stephanie and Colin for the panel that's coming later, which I'm really glad is part of the program, a way to sort of ground what we're about to talk about in the realities of your province. So I'm through, and thanks to all of you for making time. There's I think there's 75 of you now. Actually, no, sorry, over 80 now. So thank you so much. I'm joining you with gratitude from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, otherwise known as Vancouver. And I've been asked to take the first 15 minutes here to share some overall ideas from the book. As Todd just said, this has definitely been a summer of reckoning for all of us with the climate emergency. I think for a long time, for many Canadians, the emergency was somewhere distant in the future, somewhere else. Now we know it to be here and now, after the fires, the flooding, the storms in your neck of the woods. The summer began in June in my province with a heat dome that took nearly 600 mostly vulnerable seniors from us in a week. In fact, we lost more people in that week to the heat dome, as many as a third as the total number of deaths from the pandemic in the entire duration of the pandemic. So it's been a deeply unsettling summer. For those of you who haven't read my book yet, I feel like it calls on us to adopt an entirely new and different approach to the climate crisis than the one that we've pursued to date, because what we've been doing simply isn't working. In fact, I like to begin my talks just showing, I'm going to screen share with you this image. I think you should now be looking at a chart of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back the last 20 years. And what you basically see there is a flat line, little ups and downs. But to put this in the parlance we've all come to know in the pandemic, we have failed to bend the curve. Incidentally, if I showed you this same chart for your island, you would see some decline in the early years of the last decade, and then it plateaus again. But the reason why the national numbers are flat like that is really about the expansion of fossil fuel extraction and production, which has undone whatever good work you've done in PEI. To me, that chart's kind of like a visual representation of Einstein's definition of insanity. This idea that we're going to keep doing what we've been doing and expect a different result. We are not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our kids and future generations. We have run out the clock with distracting debates about incremental changes. And where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we've accomplished precious little. And so here we all are now, staring down this harrowing gap between what the science says we urgently have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. And somehow we've got to kickstart something new and move our society into emergency mode. Now, my book's original twist, as the title suggests, is that it's structured entirely around lessons from the Second World War. I didn't start off planning to write a war story. I actually cut my political teeth as a teenager in the peace and disarmament movement. I'm actually the child of Vietnam War resistors. That's how I happen to be Canadian. But I've ended up landing on the need for this wartime scale response for the reasons I just showed you. The book project began as an exploration for how we can tackle that gap. How do we align our politics and economy in Canada with what the science says we urgently have to do? And the book is that. In the original book outline, and I shared this because, this is a book event after all. In the original book outline, I had only planned to have a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War because I'd long been intrigued by the war as an example of rapid economic transformation. But as I delved into that research, I started to see more and more parallels between our wartime experience and the current crisis, and ultimately decided to structure the entire book around those lessons because I see in that history this helpful and in fact hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across class and race and gender to confront an existential threat. And in doing so, we've actually retooled our entire economy twice, in fact, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime, all in the space of 6 years. This is my first book, certainly the most creative thing I've ever done. And I spent 22 years writing policy reports for the CCPA. Now, they were good reports. They weren't exactly gripping writing, I would say. And when I set out to write a book, I met with friends who had written books to get their advice. They all said the same thing. After all these years of writing reports that talk to people's heads, you also need to touch people's hearts. You need narrative and story. And I found that in this World War II story that threads through the book. And it also jolted my thinking about, all this material that I've looked at for years. The World War II frame jolted, it made me look at that material through a new lens and with an emergency framework. But what I really didn't anticipate, but have come to appreciate in this last year since my book came out, and I've done many events like this, is how remarkably resonant this 80-year-old story remains for so many Canadians. And it gives me this opening to connect with different audiences, whether they're liberals or New Democrats or conservatives or business people or labor people or architects or journalists or farmers. Everyone's got this this connection to this story, or they're an institutional connection to this story. And I get to make a little mischief with all of them to say, these people whose story is so important to your sense of purpose, and for whom you admire what they did, the extraordinary thing they did facing this emergency. Well, here we are again. And who do you want to be? Since I released my book a year ago, I've always been asked in interviews and talks, how do you know when a government actually gets the emergency? And in trying to answer that question, I've been forced to distill this 400-page book into what I call my 4 markers of emergency mode. And this is the framework that we now use, Emma and I and our colleagues in the climate emergency unit. And I'm actually going to show you, call up another slide here. These are the 4 markers of when you know that a government or a political party or any large institution really is actually in emergency mode. It spends what it takes to win. It creates new economic institutions to get the job done. It shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures with clear near-term dates. And it tells the truth. It tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures needed to combat it. During the Second World War, Canada did all of those things. And likewise, I think most of us would probably agree that in the face of the pandemic, our governments, for the most part, hit all 4 of those markers. But with respect to the climate emergency, so far anyway, neither our federal government nor any provincial government is actually hitting any of those 4 markers. So I want to say a little bit more about each of these markers, and then we'll have time to open this up for discussion. So the first one, spend what it takes to win. A benefit of an emergency mentality is that it forces governments out of an austerity mindset. So this past year, in response to the COVID emergency, Canada's debt to GDP ratio rose from about 30% to 50%. Now that's a big jump in a single year, but it still pales in comparison to the war. We ended World War II with a debt to GDP ratio well over 100%. And when C.D. Howe, who was the federal minister who oversaw all of Canada's military production and this extraordinary ramp up in government spending, when he was pressed about that spending, he famously replied, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter." Just to give you a sense of the extraordinary spending we've seen this past year in response to the pandemic, to me, that spending merely shows what we could have done in response to the climate emergency or poverty or homelessness all along. It turns out when our governments recognize an emergency, the money is there. So just to give you a couple numbers by comparison, the whole first year of the pandemic, the Federal Bank of Canada was buying up federal government securities in order to finance the emergency response to the tune of $5 billion a week for a year. But federal spending on the climate emergency amounts to a little more than $5 billion a year. So we're not just spending a little less than we should in the face of the climate emergency. We're probably spending less by a 10-fold order of magnitude. What about that second marker? Create the new institutions needed to get the job done. During the Second World War, starting from a base of almost nothing, the Canadian economy and its labor force pumped out a volume of military equipment that is simply mind-blowing. In those 6 years, Canada, with a population less than a third what it is today, produced 800,000 military vehicles more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately building the 4th largest air force in the world at the time. Here in my province, where we struggle to build a single BC ferry anymore, we produced over 300 ships from a base of almost nothing. And remarkably, the Canadian government, under the leadership of C.D. Howe, in order to expedite this incredible ramp up in production, created 28 crown corporations to get the job done. And likewise, in the pandemic, we witnessed our federal government create, in the space of weeks, these audacious new programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy with a speed that few of us would have predicted. But in response to the climate emergency, we've seen nothing of the sort. So in contrast to all those wartime creations, the Trudeau government has established 2 crown corporations during its time in office, the Canada Infrastructure Bank And the other, I hate to tell you, is the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. It's the one that's trying to build this pipeline from Alberta to my province. If our governments really saw the climate emergency as an emergency, it would quickly conduct an inventory of all of our conversion needs and determine how many heat pumps and solar arrays and wind farms and electric buses and insulation we're going to need to electrify virtually everything and end our reliance on fossil fuels. And then we would see a new generation of public corporations to ensure those items are manufactured and deployed at the requisite scale. What about the third marker? Shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures is needed. You know, when I show you that flat line of our emissions, why have we only flatlined them? Why aren't we on a downward trajectory? Because almost everything we've done to date has been voluntary. We encourage change. We incentivize change. We offer rebates. We send price signals. What we have not done is actually require change. We need to make clear dates where we say next year, no new buildings will be able to use fossil fuel for heating. Where we would say by 2025, you won't be able to buy a vehicle that's still using fossil fuels. We would ban the advertising of fossil fuels. That's how we would signal this is an emergency. And the fourth marker, tell the truth and rally the public at every turn. It takes leadership to mobilize the public. In frequency and in tone, in words and in action, emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. And the leaders that we best remember from the Second World War were these outstanding communicators who walked this incredible line. They were forthright about the gravity of the crisis and yet still managed to impart hope. And I think we've all witnessed that this past year with the pandemic, right? The messaging is ubiquitous. We get daily press briefings. We hear regularly from public health officials. The media takes seriously its duty to inform us on a daily basis. None of that consistency and coherence, however, is present with respect to the climate emergency. When our governments don't act as if the situation is an emergency, or worse, they send contradictory messages by approving new fossil fuel infrastructure, they're effectively communicating to the public that it's not an emergency. So I've come to the end of the opening 15 minutes. Maybe, Todd, do you want me to just read one quick excerpt for a couple of minutes from the book, or do you want to jump right into Q&A?
Sure. No, I think that we'd all love to hear an excerpt.
All right. I'll pull this from the intro. Allow me to speak directly to a core doubt that is likely occurring to you at this point. A yeah, but voice in the back of your mind. You share a growing sense of alarm about the climate crisis. You want to believe that we can rally in time, but you question whether our governments acting on our collective behalf can really do what needs to be done. Years of disappointment, downsizing, deregulating, privatizing, and globalizing, of doing the bidding of various corporate interests, and sometimes of downright corruption and cronyism, have left you skeptical that we can collectively accomplish what was done in the Second World War. We meet the contemporary threat in an era of cynicism and distrust, in which the very idea of acting together has been significantly eroded, along with trust in each other and our governments. Our sense of collective ambition has been sapped, replaced by a prevailing culture of impossibility. I get all that, but come on this journey with me regardless. Why should you suspend your doubts about our collective capacity to rise to this task? Because wars transform us. Emergencies and disasters can bring out the worst in us, but they can also bring out our best. And the worthiest kind of leadership, whether at the grassroots or community level or the big P political level, seeks to animate our best selves. And in the face of the crisis, such leadership does not shy away, but rather invites us to embrace a sense of shared purpose as we collectively tackle the emergency. Today's climate crisis isn't just a demand that we remake our homes, infrastructure, and economy. It's an opening, a chance to rebuild trust, community, and democracy. I'll leave it there, and let's talk.
Awesome, Seth. All right. So first off, I just wanted to say, I absolutely love this comparison of the climate emergency to World War II. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And I'm sure I speak for all of us here on this and anyone who's seen this book and read it. It's a brilliant comparison. And I think it's an excellent way to reach and unite the masses on this. to compare it to World War II, because it's obviously something that's affected us on a grand scale still after all these decades. It's affected our culture to such a degree. And yeah, like for me, for example, as a musician, I was trying to think a few years ago, what's the best way that I could help in the climate emergency? And I thought maybe I could write a country song, or like a whole country album of songs all on the subject of climate change. Could that help connect to the masses?
All of it plays a part. But on that, just to say, there is a section in the book where I tackle the question of what's the role of arts and culture. And that too is part of the World War II story, because the public was not there and ready to rally at first. And the arts and culture community was enlisted. And we had the ubiquitous posters, and the artists were sent to the front, and the film industry pumped stuff out. And World War II had a soundtrack, a popular soundtrack, which is starting to emerge on climate, but it's early days. And so I do think there's a role for artists like yourself. I neglected to say one thing too on that fourth marker of speaking the truth. I think Prince Edward Island has a unique role to play on that. So my colleague, Emma Norton, who hails from your province, she sometimes compares PEI as Canada's Maldives. Like the Maldives, your little island is particularly vulnerable to the climate emergency. And like the Maldives, you have the possibility of punching above your weight, to be the ones to sound the alarm and speak that truth. And I think I should own that.
I fully believe that too, Seth. To quote David Suzuki, he said, "People who live on islands know that there are limits." And I think that speaks to a lot of environmental issues, of course. And yeah, we can be a microcosm example for the rest of the world, big time. So on the subject of World War II, though, I wanted to ask, at the start of World War II, were leaders hesitant like they are today to truly mobilize and treat the crisis as an emergency?
Absolutely. I mean, my book was all written before the pandemic and then came out during the pandemic. So now we have these three, I play around with these three examples: the war, the pandemic, climate. And one of the things that emerges is all emergencies begin with a period of denial. And that was true in World War II. Right up until the 11th hour, this was a population and a leadership that desperately did not want to do what would ultimately be required. And even when war was declared in September of 1939, it was half-hearted. Historian Jack Granatstein calls the initial months as one where the government wanted to prosecute what he calls a limited liability war. And historians refer to the first 9 months of World War II as the phony war. We declared war, but not really. I think we're in the phony war stage of the climate emergency, where we declare climate emergency, but we're not there yet. But what all of these things also have in common is some alchemy occurs, some combination of events and leadership that shifts the public zeitgeist and moves us into emergency mode. That's what happened in World War II. Over the events were things like the fall of France 9 months in. That changed the mindset. But it also took concerted leadership to bring the population on board. Same in the United States. It took them 2 years. And similarly in the pandemic, right? We can all remember certain events. I don't know about you, Todd. I remember when they canceled the NBA season. I don't even watch basketball. And I remember thinking, wow, that's different. I also know it took seeing our prime minister in front of his house every morning. That communicated something. But that's the kind of leadership we haven't seen yet on climate. The events are occurring. Now, helpfully, they don't all happen in the same place at the same time, but they are occurring, and Canadians get that. But the leadership has not seized it and articulated it yet.
Yeah. All right. So I'm just trying to stick to our schedule here. And also I just got a couple of notes here. Just a reminder to ask you about leaving no one behind, Seth.
Yeah, that's sort of like the fifth lesson after my four markers. And that's such a crucial one. So, let me become your weird uncle again with the war. When Canada initially declared war, thousands of people enlisted, but not nearly enough. And the early kind of propaganda appeals, go get Hitler, that works to a point, but only to a point. As of 1940-41, the government realized that if they were actually going to get across society mobilization, if they were actually going to hit the voluntary recruitment numbers they needed to hit, they had to engage Canadians in a conversation about what kind of society they would come back to. And they had to, so you saw Canada's first major income transfer programs. Unemployment insurance comes in the war. The family allowance comes in the war. The Marsh Report, which this famous report that lays the architecture for the whole post-war welfare system, is written during the war and is offered up to Canadians during the war as a pledge and a promise that the society that will emerge out the other end would look more just and more equitable than the one they were leaving behind. That's when you get the mobilization. That's when you get the recruitment numbers. And to me, that has an echo in the appeal of the Green New Deal today, where when you say to the population, we're not just going to tackle the climate emergency, we're also going to tackle inequality, and we're going to increase tax fairness, and we're going to offer a good jobs guarantee to everyone who's currently employed in the fossil fuel industry, and rebuild the caring economy. When you offer that up to Canadians, the support for the bold climate action doesn't go down, it goes through the roof. It registers levels of support beyond any political party. So I think when you're asking people to engage in a grand societal undertaking like we desperately need, you have to make that pledge and the promise that no one will be left behind, that we will tackle inequality, that we will offer economic security and employment security to people. It's the only way to get everyone on the bus.
Yep, makes perfect sense. I wish we could continue this Q&A. This is so interesting. And we also have some questions that are coming in from the audience. And I think we're going to be able to make some time for that at the end. But right now we should probably move on to our panelists. At this point, it is 7:46. So yeah, thank you so much, Seth. And we're gonna have some more questions for you later, hopefully. Yes, fantastic. We have asked each panelist to take 5 minutes to share their thoughts on what the next stage of climate mobilization is in our province, what that should look like, and then we're going to have a little discussion. So we have 3 panelists that are joining us tonight. It's just so wonderful to have them here on this online event. Stephanie Arnold is a member of BIPOC USHR, a PhD candidate with the UPEI School of Climate Change and Adaptation, and researcher with Climate Sense. Her current research areas include addressing inequities through climate change action, helping the agricultural sector navigate a changing climate, and increasing climate adaptation capacity on Prince Edward Island. She was named Emerging Thought Leader by Women in International Security Canada for her research last year. So folks, please join me in welcoming Stephanie Arnold.
Thanks, Todd. I think the one key thing that PEI needs to do is to understand the climate crisis problem for what it is. We need to understand that the climate crisis is a colonial construct. Carmen Gonzalez pointed out that European colonizers, they used oppressive practices to change what was subsistence economics of the global south into economic sidelights of Europe. And this process warmed the planet while creating wealth for the colonial powers. And this type of domination and exploitation of BIPOC peoples, of land, of ecosystems continue to this day and has spread across the globe. So from there, it becomes really clear that solving the climate crisis requires us to commit to decolonization and to re-examine our values. If we look at the attacks on the Mik'maw fishers and the fisheries as an example, the Mik'maw have a constitutionally protected right to fish. And the continued infringement of those rights is a deliberate choice to value profits over treaty rights. The group West Coast Environmental Law reminds us that conservation has been used historically to mask racist motivations. Mik'maw fishers have managed fisheries sustainably through their own laws and processes for millennia. If not for commercial fisheries, there would be no concerns for conservation. And any assumption that the Mi'kmaq is incapable of sustainably managing their own fisheries is grounded in an ideology of white supremacy. So the question then becomes, when we talk about the climate crisis, how to solve it, well, what would it take for us to value treaty rights over profits? We can't talk about simply just accelerating the shift to renewable energy. Yes, that is definitely important. But on its own, all we're going to achieve is decarbonizing oppression and exploitation. It does slow down the emissions of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. And if we're able to achieve that goal, we would still be left with a litany of environmental and social disasters. So instead, as individuals and together, we have to stop conveniently ignoring the social and environmental costs of our daily decisions. Once we focus on the right things to push back on, everything else will fall into place. So for example, we need to push back on fast fashion, not because of the waste it generates, but because we object to how it exploits natural and social systems to produce clothes at low cost. When we do that and we alter our consumption patterns, then the type and amount of waste we produce will simply change on its own. So when we adjust our priorities, our decision-making processes will change and the impacts of our decisions will follow. This applies on how we spend our money, what we teach in schools, who we elect to public office, how we hold ourselves and each other accountable, what policies we support, and so on. One benefit of focusing on values rather than just specific, separate, discrete climate actions is it helps us to make really fundamental changes we need to get ourselves out of this mess. We also begin to see how things are connected. We can start incorporating social issues in climate policy and climate issues in social policy. And we begin to ask the right questions of ourselves and of each other. So rather than trying to figure out how to maintain our status quo while lowering greenhouse gas emissions, we can start to ask, who does the status quo actually benefit? Who does it harm? And how does it contribute to the crisis at hand? Another benefit of using a value-based approach is that recognizing climate action could incidentally do harm, but we can design them to address inequalities. So for example, if we're only focused on decarbonization, our policy would simply provide subsidies for residential solar panels. Now, these subsidies are primarily used by homeowners who can likely afford them anyway, but these subsidies are prompting them to install them sooner because it's making the economics more attractive. Over time, their heating and cooling costs go down, it puts money in their pocket. But people who rent, who cannot afford homes, and who can't even afford the solar panels even with these subsidies, will continue to use less efficient, more carbon-intensive ways to heat and cool their homes. So over time, their costs go up. This solar equity gap will continue to grow between higher income households and low to medium income households. And these households already have a higher energy burden. They're spending a larger portion of their income on energy needs. But if we put equity as something that we value and we prioritize it, we can flip it around. We can use different financing approach. For example, offering loans tied to the property assessment rather than the individuals. We can remove some of these barriers. And to go a step further, we can prioritize households with higher energy burdens and underserved communities. This general approach is already being used by the US government. An executive order is directing the government to spend at least 40% of its sustainability investments on disadvantaged communities. This includes clean energy, energy efficiency, clean transit, affordable sustainable housing, training, workforce deployment, and development of critical clean water infrastructure. So even though we may not be the original colonizers, we have benefited from and we continue to reinforce directly or indirectly the legal, social, and economic structures that continually oppress Indigenous people. And these structures are also feeding the climate crisis. So solutions that are developed within these structures by these structures, but do not disrupt these structures, will not save us. When we decolonize, we will decarbonize. And as Seth has said, with our close-knit social fabric of PEI, the creativity of islanders, we've always managed to punch well above our weight. So I think let us lead the change. Let us be the status quo in waiting. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Fascinating comments there. Wonderful. We're going to move on to our next panelist. Sweta Daboo started at UPEI in September 2016 as an international student from Mauritius and graduated in May 2020 with a Bachelor of Science with honors in biology, as well as a major in political science. While at UPEI, she was involved on campus in various ways, including serving in the role of Vice President Academic and External for the UPEI Student Union. And after graduating, she was hired for the position of Executive Director of the PEI Coalition for Women in Government beginning in May 2020. Sweta is a regular contributor to CBC Island Morning's political panel and is also the co-host of a public policy podcast entitled Dialogue with Drake and Daboo. Folks, please join me in welcoming Sweta Daboo.
Thank you so much, Todd. It's really an honor to be here, especially going after Stephanie, who's made so many incredible points in such a short amount of time. So it's a tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. I think the first thing that we need to keep in mind is oftentimes climate justice tends to be presented as a standalone issue. It's presented as kind of an either or. Either you're acting to prevent climate change, or you're acting in the best of the economy. And that's not the case. What's good for climate tends to be good for the economy, as well as a reduction in social inequalities. When I was asked to speak about this today, I thought, okay, let's look at the PEI context in itself. Going off government data on greenhouse gas emissions in PEI from 2019, we emitted 1,756 kilotons. Just as a bit of frame of reference, we're aiming to decrease this to 1,200 by 2030. Looking at the major emitters of greenhouse gas on PEI, if we take a mitigation approach to climate change, we see that 44% of greenhouse gas emissions in 2019 came from transportation, 63% of which come from passenger cars and trucks. What this leads to, especially in PEI, where we know that public transportation, especially outside of Charlottetown and Stratford or the greater Charlottetown area, is quite lacking, is there's obviously a need to improve public transit. And as I mentioned before, and as Stephanie has touched on a number of times as well, is climate isn't a standalone issue, and it does tend to affect low and middle income houses more. So when we improve public transportation, especially outside of Charlottetown, which is in the middle of a housing crisis right now, you kind of improve the opportunities for folks to move out of town, and you have a more functional network around the island that leads to more development everywhere as well. A second point and a second big emitter of greenhouse gases on PEI will be agriculture, which is responsible for 25% of those emissions. And a big amount of that is due to the potatoes on PEI. So what can you do at that point is continued support for technical expertise, working with farmers in phasing in innovative measures that decrease emissions in the sector. But what's also important is, you can draft all the policies you want, you can come up with a number of regulations, but it's the enforcement part that is always necessary. What is the point of drawing in regulations and trying to regulate a sector if you're just going to be writing out exceptions for everyone that applies to them, just without thinking about the long-term gains and the long-term impacts that this will have? But looking at things from, instead of a government perspective, looking at what citizens can do, I think oftentimes when we talk about what can we do to curb climate change, it's always leave your lights off, don't use too much water. But we live in a democratic society, and especially on PEI, where all of us are related to our MLAs, have met our MLAs once or twice, or know someone who knows them. We live in kind of a perfect representation of a democracy where we have a lot of elected officials. I think it's one MLA for 5,000 people, which is incredible. So what this leads us to is the opportunity to be able to apply pressure in a number of ways. Write letters to your MLAs. Next time there's an election and someone comes knocking at your door, ask them what they can do or what their party is working on in order to mitigate the impacts of climate change. This can also come in the forms of joining various local climate action movements, or, tomorrow there's a strike at 3:30 in front of Province House for the Fridays for Future group. So that's another opportunity. So there's really many ways in which we can apply that pressure and make an impact, even as people not in decision-making positions. That's it for me.
All right, thank you so much, Sweta. Both you and Stephanie have brought forth really insightful observations. This is just fantastic. And we're going to move on to our third panelist here. Colin Jeffrey holds a master's degree in environmental studies from Dalhousie University. For the past 8 years, he has been involved in watershed restoration work on PEI, including 6 years as director of the Trout River Environmental Committee. As director of TREC, Colin completed a number of significant projects to restore the health of local rivers and involve local communities in understanding and caring for nature. Colin has a long-standing interest in how government can help us protect the environment, create equitable economic opportunities, and promote a just and peaceful society. And this interest led him to become the Green Party candidate for Rustico Emerald in the 2019 provincial election. And Colin has also undertaken a variety of environmental work, volunteer work, with the PEI chapter of Save Our Seas and Shores, Sierra Club Canada, and overseas in Brazil and Peru. So folks, please join me in welcoming Colin Jeffrey.
Thanks so much, Todd. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here participating in this event, and I'm learning a lot from this as well. It's so encouraging to see Seth come out with a book that really spells out how governments can, or how our government federally can do what it takes to win this war against climate change. Can you guys hear me okay? My internet's been a little iffy. Okay, good. All right. Good, I'll carry on here then. I just took a new job as a full-time teacher here in Halifax, so sorry if I appear a little bit tired. It's been a long day, but I have a few thoughts here just on what PEI can do moving forward. I think the biggest thing that not just PEI but everywhere in Canada needs to do is I guess bring community together to tackle this crisis and pressure the government. So I think we need to create local groups that work together and build support on a local level to keep our politicians accountable, and also find ways that each of us in our own lives can address the climate crisis and reduce our emissions. So just a few thoughts here. One thing I see is that we really have to find a way to get a greater percentage of the population concerned about climate change. A sort of core group of us are, but it's not the majority of the population yet, at least not out here in Eastern Canada, I don't think. So talking to our neighbors about this, having collectively reading books on the topic, having book clubs that look at this topic, just finding ways to reach out to other parts of our community to show people that this really is a crisis and that we need everyone on board with tackling it. I think that's really key. We have to show the danger, the risk that is there. I just read a great book called On Time and Water by Andre Snare Magnusson, an Icelandic writer. It's a great book. I really recommend it. It's about climate change, and he has some beautiful writing on the topic. It's such a enormous, overwhelming topic, and he artfully kind of grapples with it and tries to make sense of what we're facing as society. But there's a couple chapters in there that really brought to the forefront of my brain how big a threat to humanity this is at this point. And as scary as that is, it helps me stay committed to taking time out of my busy day to do something to solve this problem, and just stay committed to the task and the fight that we have here to deal with climate change. So personally, I think just keeping in mind the threat itself is useful. Just a few thoughts about the PEI government. I was really struck by how almost 50% of PEI's emissions are from transportation, right? That's that's kind of shocking. And there's so much that could be done to reduce our emissions by developing better public transit and finding creative ways for people to afford a switch to smaller electric vehicles and more efficient vehicles. I mean, let's be real, a lot of people on PEI and across Canada still drive a big truck or an SUV. You know, there's a lot that could be done there quite quickly to reduce emissions. And I like Seth's idea of requiring that no more gas-powered vehicles are sold by 2025 or 2030. Holland, for example, has already passed legislation on that. So transportation is a big one that we can tackle, and it's something we can change every day, because we all jump in a vehicle, almost all of us, every day in the Maritimes. Also farming, agriculture is 25% of PEI's emissions. And there's where a holistic approach could really make a difference, because unsustainable agriculture, through the use of large amounts of chemical fertilizers and the use of uncomposted manures and things like that, releases a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And but it also dirties our water and causes a lot of other environmental and social problems. So if we can change agriculture on PEI, we can greatly reduce our emissions, but also improve our environment in many other ways and deal with some social issues that we have. So when we think holistically in that way, and we, as Stephanie said, tackle multiple problems at once, we can get these multiple benefits, from fighting climate change to improving equality, reducing this legacy that we have in regards to Indigenous people, and improving our water quality on the island as well. It's all tied together, and we need this systemic change that that agriculture is a great example, I guess, of how systemic change could create multiple community benefits for us. So I don't want to take up too much more time, but yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer a quick question, or I'll let the event move forward.
Really well said, Colin. Excellent ideas brought forth there. And Jane Farquharson, one of the organizers of this event, said it really well too in response: bringing community together. It takes a village to defeat climate change.
Exactly.
Yep, there it is. And so I should toss it back to Seth here just for a moment. Seth, if you'd like to maybe bring forth any commentary on what the panelists
Sure.
have just.
Well, thank you to all three of you. That was terrific. And well, let me just say in turn. So Stephanie, I so completely agree around, and I talk about this in the book and have a chapter on this in the book, that one of the other key lessons in all of this is the need to center the recognition and assertion of Indigenous rights and title as part of the climate solution. And that's not just some esoteric claim. You know, my strong feeling is that in the context of a mainstream politics that has dithered and dodged on climate and keeps presenting, you know, incoherent and incomplete plans, over and over and over again, what we have witnessed is how the assertion of Indigenous rights and title is basically buying us time and blocking the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure until such time as our mainstream politics comes into alignment with what the science says we have to do. Just to give you a concrete example of that, just last week, the Indigenous Environmental Network in the States and Oil Change International published a report that tried to tally up all of the fossil fuel projects in North America that have been blocked by Indigenous-led actions. And they calculated it to be equivalent to 25% of domestic North American greenhouse gas emissions. So this isn't just some small factor. This is a huge piece of the solution. And then in addition, you've got so much of the renewable energy projects in the country, about about 20% of renewable energy projects in Canada are Indigenous led. And the equity point that you're making, your example around housing is so true. And this is why I say we have to move from a model that's just about incentivizing and rebates. When we're using a rebate model for whether it's electric cars or converting the fuels in our homes, it's mostly going to be well-off people who take advantage of it, as opposed to a different kind of approach of carrots and sticks, where we have large public expenditures. Those expenditures are focusing their efforts on those households that most need the help. And for the wealthier people, use the sticks. Just set the dates by which people have no choice. And then they can pay for it on their own, frankly. And to keep this in the concrete, I opened my talk by saying that in June in British Columbia, we lost 600 seniors, almost all renters, none of whom were in a position to switch to electric heat pump on their own. But if, as a society, we had converted those units to electric heat pump, which are also air conditioners, every one of those people would still be with us. So I think, Sweta, you really made the point about the need for that mix of carrots and sticks, whether it's on the transportation front, whether it's on the agriculture front, whether it's on the building front, which is really the three main sources of GHG emissions on your island. We need that mix, and that there's certainly an appeal to everyone as individuals to do what we all need to do in terms of converting how we get around and converting our homes. This, Sweta, you really reinforce the point. This is a political project. It's a political moment. The solution to achieve the speed and scale that's now required, it has to be state-led, but because we demanded it. That's why, what's a climate action? Tomorrow, it's 3:30. That's a climate action. They need to be feeling that pressure. And if I may, I was just scanning the questions. I see people a bit in the Q&A despairing about, a re-elected federal Liberal government. Does it set us back? Here's the good and the bad news. The bad news is, I've laid out these 4 markers, and we've all lived through this pandemic. And my question to you would be, the Liberals have moved on some stuff, and your provincial government has moved on some stuff. Is there anything about our current approach to the climate crisis that looks and sounds and feels like an emergency that invites us to engage together and across in a grand societal undertaking? I don't think there is, but that's what we need. But here's the good news, and it's out of the lessons from my book. If you had asked Canadians in 1938, this gang in Mackenzie King's cabinet, did they have what it takes to completely transform Canadian society and the economy, as was about to happen? I'm certain most Canadians would have said no, and they had no reason to believe otherwise. That same gang had done sweet nothing through a 10-year depression to meet that moment, and yet they did. Like, sometimes the leaders we have need to be replaced, and sometimes the leaders we have surprise us and become the people we need them to be. And we have to demand one or the other.
There we go. All right, so now it's time to open up the floor here and bring in some questions from the audience. I'm sure a lot of you have been waiting for this, and these questions are going to be posed to all the panelists. So anyone who would like to answer the question, you can just hop in. The question we're going to go with first is from Janelle McDonald. I'm wondering, in addition to the government support that you've outlined, how do we shift culture to accomplish climate and biodiversity goals? So again, any panelist could jump in and answer that, including Seth. Whomever would like to try their hand at that one.
I'll just say a quick word, I guess. don't want to take all the time here, but yeah, I guess this is something I was trying to speak to a bit is, I dabbled in politics and ran for the Green Party there in the last provincial election on PEI. And one thing I really felt running in the election was that politicians aren't going to take big steps outside of the norm unless they feel like the public is going to support them on it. And so I think, yes, the government needs to act like it's an emergency, but they probably aren't going to do that unless at least half the population, maybe a majority, is saying, we want you to act like this is an emergency, right? And so I think it's so key to for communities on any level to get together, network, build momentum for this, and keep pressuring politicians to act, because once they feel that pressure and they know that they're going to have hopefully a majority of the population supporting them in what they do, they're going to be more willing to step outside the box and take some bigger steps, some more concrete action on this, I think. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, awesome, Colin. Wanted to bring in Stephanie on that point as well. Did you have anything to add to that by chance, Stephanie?
I think it does start with conversations. I think a lot of different social unrest, there's a lot of things going on as we speak that require a lot of difficult conversations. And I think we just have to be comfortable having those conversations and learn to have those conversations without it being, I'm going to win this argument. Is how do we work together to get to a better future that we both want? And I think until we get that mass, I think we start small. And as we continue to do that, I think we'll just get closer and closer.
Yes. All right.
Happy to weigh in if I may too.
Great.
Sweta, do you want to weigh in first on this culture question?
Sure. Just a quick note is, oftentimes when we talk about climate change, the argument that I hear a lot is it's easy to think about climate when your stomachs are full and you have a roof over your head. And when you have, an immediate crisis, so to speak, the attention tends to shift to that. So I think that the biggest way to shift that culture is to show that the climate emergency is now, it's not in the future. And, I know Stephanie works with the UPEI Climate Lab, and a few years ago, I think it was in 2018 or 2019, when folks were actually shown how far back the shorelines would move with rising sea levels on PEI, and how many people would actually lose their houses, and how many roads and how many commercial buildings would be damaged. So it's really about showing people that this is going to impact you personally, and it's going to impact all of us personally. And it's not a future thing, it's a now thing.
It's a really great point. And I also really agree with the need for these conversations. And sometimes they're hard with our friends and families and colleagues. I interviewed a lot of politicians, to Colin's point, for the book. And I only was interested in interviewing politicians who I thought got it, like they get the science, and yet their governments weren't doing what was necessary. And when you press them on that, they all fall back to some variant of the line you use, which is you got to meet the public where they're at, and they're not there yet. Now, this was a frustrating answer I found, because first of all, the leaders that are most notable from the Second World War didn't meet the public where they were at. They took the public where they needed to go. But I also wanted to test the proposition. So I commissioned my own poll from Abacus Data. And what emerged from that is that the public is ahead of our politics. The public, both in their understanding of the emergency and their readiness to accept bold action. That's the good news. But you also see something confusing in the public opinion polling, which is a public that, expresses a large majority now anxiety and nervousness about climate. But the level of, if you will, climate literacy is very poor. Half the public doesn't know that the main source of global warming is what Sweta was talking about before, and Colin, the combusting of fossil fuels in our homes and vehicles. And so instead, when you engage the public on it and say, well, what should we do? They go right to plastics and recycling. So we need to boost that knowledge gap. And on the cultural front, one of the campaigns I would love to see, I put this out there for you now with the election behind us. I would love to see a campaign focused on the CBC to say, you know, every morning across the country, every CBC radio morning show gives us hourly sports and business reports. Let's have a morning climate emergency report. Tell us how this fight for our lives is unfolding at home and abroad every morning. Because that's what the CBC did in the war, actually.
I love that idea. Yes. Brilliant, Seth. We should all push for that. Let's get to the next question here from the anonymous attendee. What can the average citizen do to help get governments closer to meeting those 4 markers? And Seth, would you want to maybe speak to that first? And I'd love for Sweta to comment on this too, but briefly, if you wanted to comment on that first, Seth.
Well, I mean, this, just to reiterate, it's a political project. So they need to be hearing from us all the time in different ways, whether it's tomorrow out on the streets, whether it's by meeting with our political leaders at all levels of government, and to be setting an expectation of what we are all looking for. But when we say climate emergency, that we're looking for evidence of these 4 markers. By the way, maybe Emma wants to put the link again in the chat, but I would invite people to get on the e-newsletter list for our unit, the Climate Emergency Unit, where we're trying to seed these kinds of ideas as ways to put pressure on our political leaders. But they need to be feeling it. And we can move to that mode. In fact, let me just say this too. Let me share another story that's relevant to tomorrow's protest. I live in Vancouver. Vancouver has an actual climate emergency plan, unlike our province, unlike our federal government. It hits all 4 markers. It was won over the last 2 years. How was it won? And it's a very politically divided council, by the way. They're not all lefties. No one has a majority. It's very divided. Now I'm biased in this story because the city councillor in Vancouver who moved the climate emergency motion happens to be my wife. But how was it? But each time these climate emergency votes were brought forward, they actually passed unanimously. Now, how did that happen? That happened because, in addition to the fact that my wife's really good at her job, but she would say it happened because each time those votes happened, dozens of high school students skipped school. They rallied outside. They spoke before council. They filled the chambers. And they basically made it impossible for even the more conservative councillors to vote no. They did that. And now we have one of the most ambitious climate plans at the municipal level anywhere in North America. And as of next year, no new buildings in Vancouver will be able to tie into gas.
That is so inspiring. I love that. Okay, next question. Let's get to this question from our leader of the opposition here, Green Party leader, Peter Bevan Baker. It's great to see you part of this event, Peter. And so he says, thank you to everyone for a wonderful event and to Seth for a compelling book. On page 203 of the book, Seth poses the rhetorical question, is solving the climate crisis fundamentally at odds with capitalism? Here in PEI, we are a small jurisdiction with large powers. We have control over many of the big levers that can shape our future for better or for worse. My question is, how can we create a local regional model of the regenerative, equitable economy many of us envision and the beacon of sustainability that I believe we can be here in PEI in the midst of a sea of strife and dependent as we are on a global effort? So I would love to hear, well, all of you chime in on that, but whoever might like to respond to it first. Yeah, I guess maybe Seth, if you want.
Try to buy the rest of you some time, maybe. Well, look, I posed the question, so let me answer it. My argument in the book is that while not necessarily in conflict with capitalism, it is certainly in conflict with neoliberalism, as we have come to understand it. Like, why aren't we spending what we need to win? Why aren't we creating audacious new public institutions to get the job done? Why aren't we just using the regulatory power of the state to get this job done? because all of our political parties across the political spectrum at some level are straitjacketed by these neoliberal assumptions about what is and isn't allowed. And that's what we need to bust out of. And that's what we busted out of in the war, to become to be that uncle again. Look, in the war, someone in the chat talked about Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941. In February of 1942, 2 months later, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly line in Detroit, and for the next 4 years, their production was illegal in the USA. Now, that didn't happen because of the goodwill of the big three automakers or their patriotism or anything like that. It happened because they were ordered. They had no choice. So there's a role, there was a role for the private sector in the war, and there's a role for the private sector in meeting the climate emergency, creating, important new technologies and so on. But if we're hoping that the private sector is going to voluntarily do what needs to be done at the speed and scale required, we're fried.
Yes, love it. Excellent. And panelists, any of you would like to hop in on that? Stephanie, we haven't heard from you in a while, or Sweta or Colin.
I saw a great quote that made me think. It said something along the lines of, we can more easily imagine people dying than we can imagine a new economic system. And it just really, I don't know what the new economic system is, but it isn't what we have today. And so I can't really answer the question of what it might look like for PEI. But I do think, just based on sort of my little 5-minute spiel about our values, I think we can no longer afford to hide environmental and social costs in the price tags that we pay for goods. I think it starts simply by consumers having upward pressure in where we spend our money. And as Seth has also said, we need sticks too, and to put downward pressure on corporations that are responsible for hiding some of these costs. So again, it's in the war effort type metaphor, is all hands on deck, whether it's top down or bottom up. We don't have to choose, we'll do both.
Yes, beautifully said, Stephanie. Thank you for that. We are getting very close to the end here. It's 8:26, and our aim was to wrap this up at 8:30 for everyone, which is a shame because this is such a fascinating, engaging discussion. I would love for this to just continue all night long. I'm sure I'd speak for a lot of us when I say that. There's so many questions here in the Q&A that I would love to be able to get to. Thank you all so much for your questions, and maybe perhaps we might be able to get some of the panelists to speak to these in follow-up messages after this or something, if we can maybe keep track of these questions, because they're just really great gems of questions. Just a shame that we don't have enough time for all of this. Yeah, I think we are getting to that wrapping up stage here. So I just wanted to bring forth a couple of final words. Got to get my notes out here. Oh, there they are. So thank you and Wilaliak to everyone who joined tonight. As mentioned earlier, we would love to stay in touch after tonight's event and turn on our passion for climate emergency and turn that into action. And once again, I do need to mention on that note the event tomorrow, the climate strike happening in Charlottetown, 3:30 to 4:30. Hope to see a lot of you there. I'll be there, that's for sure. And that's going to be a really empowering event, as it always is for the climate strikes. And you're going to receive a survey after this, and so that's going to provide us. You'll receive a survey through which to provide us your contact information in a follow-up email. That's what it says. Yes, got it. And so to wrap things up, I was asked to write a song for this event and have it speaking to the climate emergency, of course. And as I was trying to figure out how I would write the song, the phrase "live the solution" kept coming in my head. I over the past year, my wife and I have been we've been benefiting from having solar panels on our property that we got installed last summer. And just about 6 weeks ago, I did get an electric car, finally, something I've been dreaming of for a long time. So it does feel like, as I'm going about my days now, commuting, it feels like I'm living a part of the solution. And as we've heard many ideas here tonight about the proper ways to move forward, there are all kinds of solutions. And I know we're all going to carry forth from tonight, bringing those into action as best as we can. But yeah, this is all about living the solution. And by the way, I was also given the note of like, maybe you could try to be PEI's Raffi. So that's like a sing-along kid song kind of thing. So that's what I aim for. And hopefully you all enjoy it. Again, huge thanks to everyone for tonight for being part of this. This has been such an inspiring and engaging event. All right, here we go. If you say we won't do it, if they don't do it, that's no way to be. To solve these problems, we know that the answer is to take the lead. Smog fills up the skies, plastic in the seas, and each day we lose more species. But if you had a dog, you'd care for her every day. You want a healthy dog, it's the way to stop the pollution, live the solution, give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is the way. We're cutting too many trees, there's far too much disease, and there's another storm on the breeze. But if you had a cat, you'd care for him every day, wouldn't you? You want a healthy cat, it's the way. Stop the pollution, live the solution, give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is the way. If you say we won't do it, if they don't do it, that's no way to be. To solve these problems, we know that the answer is to take the lead. So here you've got an earth to care for every day. You want a healthy earth, it's the way to stop the pollution, live the solution, give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is the way to stop the pollution, live the solution, give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is a way to stop the pollution, live the solution, give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is a way. Give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is the way. Give a little love to the earth each day. If you want a healthy world, this is the way. This is the way. Thank you so much, folks, everyone, for joining in tonight. Again, what an inspiring event. Seth Klein, all of our panelists, Colin Jeffrey, Sweta, Daboo, Stephanie Arnold, and again, thanks to everyone who was part of this night. Emma Norton, just incredible with all the organizing that you did for this, and Dan Mcdonald from the Bookmark, Jane and Mary from the Council of the Canadians. I will pass it on to Dan to just do a few little wrap-up thank yous. I think that's what I'm supposed to do, isn't it? Is Dan still here and ready to do this? Oh, maybe I wasn't supposed to do that.
It's all right. We decided that Dan would say it at the beginning before everyone left. Thanks,
It's true,
Todd.
we did
Thanks,
decide that.
everyone. Yeah.
I was following the old schedule, but there's Dan again. You get to see him and Emma. Bravo.
Great.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks, everybody. This is wonderful. I am so inspired, and I messaged Seth privately that Bookmark, for what we can do, we're on side with this. We just love it. And thank you, everybody, for attending tonight, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Seth Klein.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.